On to the bacteria, which we know quite a bit more about than we do the archaea. The archaea is still something that we're learning about, and of course bacteria is as well, but we have studied some bacteria, particularly like E. coli, for many, many years, and so we begin to learn quite a bit more about them. We have sequenced the entire genome of the E. coli bacteria and things of that nature, so we have a little bit more information about them. Bacteria include the vast majority of prokaryotes, of which most people are aware. They have quite a bit of diversity as well. Diverse nutritional types are scattered among the major groups of bacteria, and we're going to take a look at some of the major groupings of bacteria on text page 568 and 569. You can see that there's basically 5 major groups of bacteria, and we're going to try to hit on some of these, kind of talk about how they are alike, how they're different, and some certain aspects of the 5 major groups of bacteria. Some of these bacteria are harmful to us. They cause problems, they cause diseases, say like strep throat or ear infections, and then some of them are beneficial. Some of them are used in agriculture, some of them are used in industry, some of them are even used in creating food like yogurt and cheese. There are beneficial bacteria that live inside your intestines that help you in your digestive process. So some of these are good and some of them are not so good, but they certainly outnumber us on the planet, and they certainly are a major part of life on planet Earth. So going back to our very simplified taxonomy, our very simplified phylogeny, our phylogenetic tree of life, we have our last common ancestor here, and we have the major branching point. The one branch leads to the bacteria, and that's where we are now. In your textbook on page 568 and 569, they kind of divide the bacteria into 5 major groups, and those 5 major groups include the proteobacteria, the chlamydias, the spirochetes, the cyanobacteria, and the gram-positive bacteria. The first one we're going to look at are the proteobacteria. That's an interesting term or word for this particular group, proteobacteria. Proteo comes from the Greek god Proteus, which was the god of water. He was the god of the oceans and the streams and the seas and the lakes, and he could take a wide variety of forms. So this is a good term for this group because there's a wide variety of bacteria within this group called proteobacteria. These proteobacteria are gram-negative bacteria, and they include photoautotrophs and chemoautotrophs and heterotrophs. Some of them are aerobic, some of them are anaerobic, so there's a huge variety. So you can see that this category called proteobacteria, that's a good name for them just because there's such a wide variety. Currently, molecular systematists recognize about 5 subgroups of proteobacteria, and we're going to take a look just briefly at those 5 subgroups. So the big category bacteria called proteobacteria, made up of the gram-negative bacteria in 5 subcategories. Now the good news is all they did was they just used Greek letters to name the 5 subcategories. So they're called alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon. They didn't really get too fancy in naming them. And we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail about them, but I want to talk just briefly about a few of them and perhaps some of the ones that you've heard before. So in our tree here, this is leading up to the proteobacteria and the 5 subcategories of the proteobacteria. Starting with the top of the alphabet, let's start with the alpha proteobacteria. These species are closely associated with eukaryotic hosts. In other words, a lot of these species of bacteria form symbiotic relationships with eukaryotic hosts. And scientists hypothesize that one of these alpha proteobacteria was the type of bacteria that was taken in that became the mitochondria. The mitochondria of eukaryotic cells looks most similar to aerobic alpha proteobacteria. So they think that one of these aerobic alpha proteobacteria was taken in through endosymbiosis and eventually became what we now think of as the mitochondria. Some examples of some of these alpha proteobacteria include rhizobium, which forms a relationship with plant roots, and it forms this nitrogen fixation relationship where it fixes atmospheric nitrogen that then makes it available for the plants. And another one called agrobacterium, which produces plant tumors, which we actually use in genetic engineering. So this is alpha proteobacteria, our first subgroup of the proteobacteria. Here are some rhizobium within the roots of root cells of a legume. A legume would be like a pea plant or a peanut plant. So you can see the bacteria actually live inside the cells or live within the cells of the plant's roots. Second subgroup is the beta proteobacteria, and again, a lot of these work in kind of conjunction or relationships with other creatures. A good example is the soil bacterium Nitrosomonas. Nitrosomonas is also a nitrogen fixer. It changes one form of nitrogen to another, and this allows the nitrogen to be useful or to be picked up and taken up by different types of plants. Going off to the third subgroup, the gamma proteobacteria, some examples include sulfur bacteria such as Chromatium and pathogens such as Legionella, Salmonella, and Vibrio cholera. So Legionella causes an infection known as, or a sickness known as Legionnaire's disease. Salmonella is what's responsible for many types of food poisoning, and Vibrio cholera causes the disease that we call cholera. The most well-known of the gamma proteobacteria is the Escherichia coli, which we normally just call E. coli. So Escherichia coli, that resides in the intestines of many mammals. There are plenty of E. coli inside you, and normally E. coli bacteria are not pathogenic. They don't cause illness. They don't cause us to be sick. Now, some variations of E. coli do become pathogenic, and unfortunately that can be passed on to other bacteria through that conjunction process we talked about. E. coli is pretty much the most well-known and studied prokaryote on the planet. We know more about E. coli than we do any other bacteria, definitely. Here is one example of a gamma proteobacteria. On to the next subgroup, the delta proteobacteria. Some examples of the delta proteobacteria include slime secreting what we call myxobacteria, and I picked this one line up out of the textbook just because I thought it was so fascinating. If you go down here, follow the arrow down to where it starts with the sentence another group of delta proteobacteria, the Delavibrios, attack other bacteria, charging at up to 100 micrometers per second. That would be comparable to a human running 240 kilometers per hour. The attack begins when the Delavibrio attaches to specific molecules found on the outer covering of some bacterial species. The Delavibrio then drills into its prey by using digestive enzymes and spinning at 100 revolutions per second. I just thought that was fascinating to think that there are life and death struggles going on at a microscopic level. I can imagine that. I mean, if you go to Africa and you go to the Serengeti, the plains of Africa, and you see lions attacking, say, a zebra, and the zebra struggling to survive, and you see hyena interacting with other creatures, I get all the life and death struggle going on in the big animal world, but it's amazing to think that that same life and death struggle, the same sort of attack and hunting and killing and eating and destroying, is also going on at the microscopic level with some of these bacteria. Here's an example of the delta proteobacteria. This is actually showing you the fruiting bodies, which are reproductive portions of the bacteria of a myxobacterium. Finally, the last subgroup of the proteobacteria is the epsilon proteobacteria. A good example of this would include a number of pathogens, including Campylobacter, which causes blood poisoning. Sometimes if you get a cut and it gets infected, you can get blood poisoning from this particular bacteria. And Helicobacter pylori is what causes stomach ulcers, and there's a little guy right there that causes your stomach ulcer. So that's the epsilon proteobacteria. Again, these are all subgroups under the proteobacteria, which is just a wide grouping of many different kinds of bacteria. Moving on to the other bacterial groups, we'll just briefly take a look at some of them. We have the chlamydias, the spirochetes, the cyanobacteria, and then the gram-positive bacteria. Starting off with the chlamydias, many of these are parasites that live within animal cells. As a matter of fact, I think pretty much all of the chlamydias are parasites that live within animal cells. A good example is a chlamydia trachomatis that causes blindness and urethritis, which is an inflammation of the urethra. So this is an STD, a sexually transmitted disease, and you've probably heard of the term chlamydia before. The arrows are pointing to the chlamydia that lives inside of the animal cell and causes a wide variety of problems. The The spirochetes, you can probably tell from their name, they are spiral in shape, they are helical heterotrophs. Some of them are parasites, including Treponema pallidum, which causes syphilis, which is another sexually transmitted disease. Borrelia burgdorfera, man, I don't know how to pronounce that one. Borrelia burgdorfera, which causes Lyme disease. Lyme disease is passed on by ticks, like they may bite a deer that has the spirochete inside its bloodstream, and then they bite you and it passes that spirochete onto you and causes Lyme disease. Too bad that they cause so many problems, because it is beautiful to look at underneath the microscope. This is a transmission electron microscope picture, so it would originally be black and white. They've just added the color to help it stand out. The fourth major category of bacteria is the cyanobacteria. These are the ones that are photosynthetic, that can take energy from the sun and use that to combine with carbon dioxide and make their own food. They are photoautotrophs. They generate oxygen. They are the only prokaryotes with plant-like oxygen-generating photosynthesis, and it's thought that cyanobacteria is what became chloroplast in plants. That plant chloroplast likely evolved from the process of endosymbiosis, taking in of one of these cyanobacteria into the interior of another cell. And here they are right there. You can see they're green with the chlorophyll inside of them, cyanobacteria. Last but not least, we have the category called gram-positive bacteria. There is almost as many types of gram-positive bacteria as we have the proteobacteria. The gram-positive bacteria include a wide number of different kinds and varieties, including the actinomycetes. The actinomycetes you might be familiar with because they help decompose soil, and they're within the soil. Whenever you till up a garden, or you go out and you work in the front yard and work in your mom's garden or your dad's garden, especially maybe after a rain shower, and you get that lovely kind of earthy, woodsy smell, well, that oftentimes is actually coming from the actinomycetes within the soil. Some other examples of gram-positive bacteria: Bacillus anthracis, which causes the disease anthrax; Clostridium botulinum, which causes botulism; Staphylococcus and Streptococcus. You can tell by the end of the word coccus that these are little round ball-shaped bacteria. Both of these can be pathogenic: staph infections, strep throat, that type of thing. And then the last one is mycoplasms. Mycoplasms are the smallest known cells of all, the smallest of all living cells. They are the only bacteria that don't have a cell wall, and some of them are barely larger than some of the organelles of a eukaryote. Some of them are only about 5 times the size of a ribosome, which is pretty darn amazingly small. So here's a couple of examples. This is Streptomyces, which is oftentimes used to create antibiotics to help fight off other bacteria. And then if you look at this particular human cell, this fibroblast cell, but do you see all these tiny white dots on the cell? Those are actually mycoplasms, the tiniest of bacteria cells, the tiniest cells that we know of. So those are a wide variety of the different types of bacteria, the 5 major groupings of proteobacteria, the chlamydias, the spirochetes, the cyanobacteria, and the gram-positive bacteria. And we looked at the subgroups under the proteobacteria, which would be the alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and epsilon. I wouldn't expect you to know every single detail about those, but it's helpful to know some of the more common ones and kind of what makes some of the differences between them. We'll take a break. We'll come back and we'll talk about how important these prokaryotes are in our biosphere.